Let's start with the United States, because here's something most Americans don't even realize is strange. There is no American school system. That sounds impossible. It's a single country. Surely there's one system? There isn't. In the United States, education is controlled at the state and local level, which means the country is split into thousands of separate school districts, each making its own decisions. Different rules, different funding, different everything. And here's where it gets genuinely bizarre. A large chunk of school funding comes from local property taxes. The quality of a child's public school can depend heavily on how expensive the houses are in the neighborhood around it. So two kids in the same state, a 20-minute drive apart, can walk into two completely different worlds. One school has a planetarium and a robotics lab. The other is patching holes in the roof. Same country, same age, same dreams. Supporters argue this local control lets communities shape schools around their own needs, instead of taking orders from a distant national government. Critics argue it bakes inequality directly into the system from day one, before a child has learned a single thing. The result is a country capable of producing some of the best universities in the world and some of the most under-resourced classrooms in the developed world, sometimes in the same city. The United States didn't build one education system. It built thousands and left them to compete. Before we go further, if you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. Now cross the Atlantic to the United Kingdom, where the big divide isn't your zip code. It's a much older, quieter thing. In the UK, most children attend free state schools, but sitting alongside them is a parallel world of private schools, confusingly called public schools, which cost enormous sums of money and have educated a startling share of the country's prime ministers, judges, and leaders for centuries. So from an early age, British children can end up on very different tracks. And the whole system funnels toward a gauntlet of high-stakes exams. First, the GCSEs around age 16. Then, for many, A-levels, which heavily influence which university will take you. Here's the part that surprises outsiders. British students often specialize incredibly early. While a teenager in America might study a little of everything, a student in England might drop almost every subject to focus on just 3 for their final years. Pick science, and you may barely touch history again. The system asks you to narrow down fast. Supporters argue this produces real depth. By the time a UK student reaches university, they've gone further into their chosen subjects than students almost anywhere else. Critics argue it forces teenagers to close doors before they've had the chance to discover what's behind them. And the old private school divide refuses to disappear. Debates about fairness, access, and privilege have followed the British system for generations. The UK built a system of remarkable academic depth, sitting on top of a class question it has never fully answered. Let's go somewhere that feels almost impossible after that. The Netherlands, home to what surveys repeatedly find are some of the happiest school children on the entire planet. And you have to ask, how? What are the Dutch doing that everyone else isn't? Part of the answer is almost funny in its simplicity. In the early years, Dutch children get very little homework. Young kids are largely left to be young kids. The pressure that defines childhood in so many countries is deliberately turned way down. Then there's the culture around it. Enormous numbers of Dutch children simply bike to school themselves, part of a wider culture of trusting kids with real independence early. They're not shuttled everywhere in a state of anxiety. They're handed a bit of freedom and expected to handle it. Dutch schools also tend to emphasize collaboration and well-being over relentless competition, especially when children are small. The goal in those early years isn't to crown the top student. It's to make sure school feels like a place a child wants to be. Supporters point to those happiness rankings and say the results speak for themselves. Happy, secure kids grow into stable, capable adults. Critics wonder whether a lower-pressure early environment leaves some students less prepared for the fiercely competitive world waiting outside. But the Dutch seem willing to make that trade. In a world obsessed with ranking children as early and as often as possible, the Netherlands made a strange bet. It bet on childhood. Now for the near-perfect opposite. Russia, where the education system carries the weight of a very different history and a very different attitude toward pressure. Russian schooling has deep roots in the Soviet era, and it kept a lot of that DNA. A strong, some would say relentless, emphasis on mathematics, science, and rigorous academic content from a young age. This is not a system built around going easy on children. At the end of it all waits the Unified State Exam, known as the EGE. And this single exam carries enormous weight, shaping which universities a student can realistically hope to enter. Years of study funnel toward those few days of testing. The style of learning leans heavily on rigor and mastery of difficult material. Russian strength in fields like mathematics and the hard sciences is internationally recognized, and it didn't come from nowhere. It came from a system that pushes core academic subjects hard, early, and without much apology. Supporters argue this produces genuine intellectual firepower, especially in technical fields, and a population with strong foundations in exactly the subjects many other countries struggle to teach. Critics point to the intensity, the pressure of a system where so much rides on standardized testing, and concerns about how much room is left for creativity and independent thought. Where the Netherlands turned the pressure down, Russia turned it up. Two countries, two completely opposite theories of what a child needs, and both are utterly convinced they're right. Now to South America and to Brazil, a country where the story of education is really a story about a single, enormous gap. Brazil is massive, hundreds of millions of people, spread across sprawling cities, remote rainforest, and everything in between. And running straight through its education system is a divide so wide it almost defines the whole thing, the gap between public and private schools. Here's the strange twist that catches outsiders off guard. In Brazil, wealthier families often pay for private schools during the younger years, precisely so their children can win a spot at the best public universities, which are free, prestigious, and fiercely competitive. To get in, students face the vestibular exams and a national exam called the ENEM. So you get this almost upside-down situation, private schooling early to reach elite public university later. And the students who most need that free public university are often the ones whose earlier schooling left them least prepared to compete for it. Supporters point to Brazil's top universities, which are genuinely world-class, and to reforms and programs aimed at widening access for students who were historically shut out. Critics argue the system can end up reinforcing the very inequality it's supposed to break, rewarding the families who could already afford a head start. Brazil isn't struggling because it doesn't value education. It's struggling with something harder. How do you deliver it fairly across a country this vast, this diverse, and this unequal? That's a problem no reform has fully solved yet. Stay in the region, hop over to an island, and prepare for the biggest surprise on this list: Cuba. On paper, this shouldn't work. Cuba is not a wealthy country. It's spent decades under economic strain and sanctions. By almost any economic measure, it's poor. So logically, its education system should be struggling. Instead, it's one of the best in Latin America. The literacy rate is nearly universal, among the highest anywhere in the world. And that didn't happen by accident. In the early 1960s, Cuba launched a massive literacy campaign, sending young volunteers out into the countryside to teach ordinary people to read, and it worked on a scale that stunned observers. But the real shock is the money. Cuba pours an unusually large share of its economy into education, historically around 10% or more of its entire GDP, one of the highest rates on the planet. In a country with limited resources, education isn't an afterthought. It's the priority. Supporters point to the outcomes: near universal literacy, strong performance by students in international assessments relative to the country's wealth, and an enormous number of teachers and doctors per person, so many that Cuba actually sends doctors abroad. Critics point out that the system is tightly state-controlled and heavily shaped by government ideology, and that there are real questions about freedom and independent thought within it. But you cannot ignore the core lesson here. And it's a big one. Cuba proved that a country doesn't need to be rich to educate its people well. It just needs to decide that education comes first, and then actually mean it. Most wealthy countries have never made that choice. Now for the country with the strangest logistics problem on this entire list. Australia, where the challenge isn't money or ideology, it's distance. Staggering, almost unimaginable distance. Picture a child living on a cattle station in the Australian outback. The nearest school isn't down the road. It might be hundreds of kilometers away across empty desert. For that child, a normal school is simply impossible. So Australia invented something extraordinary: the School of the Air. It started back in 1951, and the idea was pure outback ingenuity. Teachers used the radio network built for the flying doctors and began broadcasting lessons over the airwaves to children scattered across the wilderness. For many of those kids, it was the first time they'd ever heard the voices of a teacher or classmates they'd never met. Today, the radios are mostly gone, replaced by satellite internet and video links. But the mission is exactly the same. A teacher in a town like Alice Springs delivers lessons to a handful of children spread across an area larger than many entire countries. A parent or a live-in tutor supervises at home. And a few times a year, these students who've only ever met over a screen finally travel in to meet each other face to face. Supporters call it one of the most remarkable educational ideas ever built. proof that no child is too remote to reach. Critics note the obvious challenges: isolation, patchy internet in the bush, and the heavy reliance on parents to keep it all running day to day. But think about what it represents. While other countries argued about exams and rankings, Australia looked at a child alone in the middle of a desert and refused to accept that geography could win. It built the largest classroom on Earth and filled it with kids nobody else could reach. For our last stop, let's go to Kenya, a country in the middle of trying to reinvent its entire education system in real time. For decades, Kenya ran on a structure known as 8-4-4, 8 years of primary school, 4 of secondary, 4 of university, and hanging over it all were national exams so important they could shape a child's entire future in a single sitting. One set of tests, years of consequences. But Kenya decided that model wasn't working anymore, so it began a massive shift toward a new competency-based curriculum, designed to focus less on memorizing facts and passing one enormous exam, and more on practical skills, creativity, and applying what you actually learn. A whole nation rewiring how it teaches mid-flight. And this is all happening against a backdrop of real determination. In many parts of Kenya, education is treated as the clearest path out of poverty, and families sacrifice heavily for it. In some rural areas, children still walk long distances every single day just to reach a classroom. Nobody is taking school for granted. Supporters believe the new approach will produce a generation better prepared for real work and real life, instead of students who are simply good at sitting exams. Critics point to the enormous difficulty of changing an entire system at once. The cost, the training, the strain on families and teachers trying to adapt on the fly. Kenya represents something you rarely get to watch this clearly. A country deciding out loud that the old way of educating its children wasn't good enough and choosing to rebuild while the whole thing is still running. That takes nerve.